Well, I would like to welcome all of you to the John Carter Brown Library. My name is Neil Safier. I'm the director and librarian of the JCB, and it is my pleasure to welcome you for this continuing series to celebrate and commemorate the 250th anniversary of the founding of Brown University in this series entitled Brown's Founding in a Global Context. As many of you know, I'm sure, November is Native American Heritage Month, and undoubtedly this lecture was partially timed in order to acknowledge that by those who organized this lecture series long before I arrived at the library, Margot Nishimura and Lynn Fisher. This was a very convenient timing as well, since last month here at the library we launched a new Indigenous Studies initiative. I think many of you in the audience were here for that, which is an attempt really to try to open the library up to other groups and other institutions, departments here at Brown, as well as throughout the region and indeed throughout the hemisphere, to really take Indigenous studies seriously and to showcase the kinds of materials and the kind of work that scholars do here at the library. Again, not only in this particular region, but really throughout the Americas. As part of that initiative, we are going to be supporting and sponsoring lectures, like the lecture that we're going to be hearing tonight, although that was not sponsored by the Indigenous Studies Initiative, but rather the Office of the 250th celebrations, as well as the Department of History, which is one of the long-term sponsors, and also this evening by the Haffenreffer Museum of Anthropology, whose director I'll introduce in just a moment. We're also going to be sponsoring special fellowships. In fact, our fellowship applications are due on December 1st for short-term and long-term fellowships. So if I see some of you sneaking out toward the end of the lecture, I'll know that it's to prepare for this new Indigenous Studies fellowship that we hope that you will be applying for in droves. We'll also be putting out very soon a call for applications for special symposia that we'll be sponsoring for Brown faculty and graduate students in the coming semester, and possibly even beyond that, to organize events and activities around that. So there's a lot that is happening right now at the library, and the doors are open to sort of think about other ways of bringing Indigenous studies to the fore. One of the efforts behind this series, as many of you know, is to engage with other institutions and departments on the Brown campus. And this has really been a wonderful part of the 1764 series. In this particular case, it is with the Haffenreffer Museum of Anthropology. In fact, after the lecture tonight, we will be having our traditional reception, not here in the reading room, but in fact across the green at the Haffenreffer. And we warmly, no pun intended, since it is so cold out, encourage you to don your jackets and cross the green and join us for a drink after the lecture. With that, I would like to introduce the director of the Haffenreffer Museum and professor of anthropology here at Brown, Bob Preucel, who will be introducing our evening speaker.
Thank you, Neil. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Colin Callaway, who I think most historians would agree is the preeminent historian of Native North America. Colin is the John Kimball Jr. 1943 Professor of History and Professor of Native American Studies at Dartmouth College. He received his PhD from the University of Leeds in 1978, and upon graduation, he taught at Wakefield College of Technology and Arts for 2 years before taking a position at the College of Ripon and York St. John and everything seemed to be right on course. Then in 1982, he and his wife made the momentous decision to pack up and move to Vermont. As he puts it, I was living with my new in-laws, had no job or prospect of employment in American academia, and wondered what on earth I was going to do with myself in a northern New England backwater. He looked around and found a position as an adjunct lecturer at Keene State College, and he ended up teaching at Springfield High School. The principal's rationale for hiring him was simple. You're English, teach him English. He persisted in his research, and in fact, he says that he wrote his way into academia. His breakthrough came when he was selected in 1985 as an associate director and editor at the famous Darcy McNichol Center for History of the American Indian at the Newberry Library, where Linford is right now. After 2 years in Chicago, he took a faculty position at the University of Wyoming, where he taught for 8 years. He joined the faculty at Dartmouth, first as a visiting professor in 1990, 1991, and 1993, and must have made a good impression because he was then permanently hired there as a full professor in 1995. Colin has served as president of the American Ethnohistory Society and has sat on the editorial boards of the Penguin Library of American Indian History, the New Directions in Native Studies series for the University of Oklahoma Press, Native Americans of the Northeast series for the University of Massachusetts Press, the Early American History series for Oxford University Press and JCB, and the journal Ethnohistory. He was a senior editor of Native American history for the Oxford Online Research Encyclopedia in American History. Colin is the author or editor of over 24 books on Native American history, and at the risk of embarrassing him, I'm going to list a few of the titles so that you can get a sense of the breadth of his scholarship. So these include The Shawnees and the War for America, published by Viking Penguin in 2007. The Scratch of a Pen, 1763 and the Transformation of North America, published by Oxford University Press in 2006. One Vast Winter Count, The Native American West Before Lewis and Clark, published by the University of Nebraska Press in 2003. New Worlds for All, Indians, Europeans, and the Remaking of Early America, Johns Hopkins Press in 1997. Crown and Calumet, British Indian Relations, 1783 to 1815, University of Oklahoma Press, 1997. The American Revolution in Indian Country, Cambridge University Press, 1994. The Western Abenakis of Vermont, 1600 to 1800, the University of Oklahoma Press in 1990. He has edited or co-edited 3 collections of essays, and he's edited several compilations of historical documents. He's published an important history of Dartmouth College, which, as many of you know, was founded as an Indian college in 1769. There's a book over there by Elizar Wheelock, which describes it. And he's published a book on Native Americans for young adults. One of his most remarkable books is his investigation of the similarities of Indian and Scottish peoples, both resisting the expansion of the British Empire and both thrown together in the story of America. In some ways, this is an investigation of his own heritage and background. Colin has received numerous awards and honors for his scholarship. He's an elected member of the American Antiquarian Society and elected fellow of the Society for American Historians. His books have won awards from the Organization of American Historians, the Western History Association, the Western Writers of America, and the Denver Public Library. His book, The American Revolution in Indian Country, was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. In 2011, Colin received the Western History Association's American Indian History Lifetime Achievement Award. This award is given to an individual for helping Native American students and advancing the study of American Indian history. Here I have to say that Colin stands out among his colleagues, such as James Merrill and Dan Richter, in that he is not only a scholar of the ethnohistory of colonial America, he's also deeply committed to the education and welfare of Native American students. He's been intimately involved with Dartmouth's famous Native American Studies program and served as chair from 1997 to 2009. He was honored for this work by Native American students at the Dartmouth Powwow in 2004, and then again in 2010, invited as a speaker at the senior student honoring. Let me now turn to his scholarship and comment on what I consider to be some of his most important contributions. Colin challenges to think critically about the dominant stereotypes so pervasive in American textbooks. For example, he reveals the limits of the narrative of Western expansion, the popular idea that history moves from east to west that it was established with the arrival of the Pilgrims whose descendants moved to settle the West. This view constrains our understanding of the history of the continent, and important historical developments happened as a result of movements not just from east to west, but also from south to north. First with the introduction of corn, and later with the arrival of the horse and the Spanish. And this is an extremely important corrective to American history, and of course one relevant to my own work, since I work on the archaeological history of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. But he goes on to argue a key epistemological point that may come from his knowledge of native worldviews. I haven't asked him this. He argues that all people see themselves as living in the center of their own universes and not living on the edges of someone else's. They're facing not just west or east, but rather facing all directions. This perspective is entirely consistent with Native American cosmologies. For example, in the Pueblo world, the world I study, the Pueblo world is delineated by 7 directions, by the center place plus the 4 cardinal directions plus the zenith and nadir. In his book, One Vast Winter Count, The Native American West Before Lewis and Clark, Colin makes the provocative claim that Lewis and Clark did not bring the West into U.S. history. Rather, they brought the U.S. into Western history. He emphasizes that the West was not a vacant area, but a rich tapestry of peoples and cultures that had formed over tens of thousands of years. He refuses to define the West in terms of the popular discovery trope, and instead favors an ecological perspective. He notes that the lack of water shaped the lifestyles of native peoples and provided them with the resources and strategies necessary to respond to Europeans, from the Spanish to French to the British and the United States. Rather than portraying the resistance of Native Americans as isolated acts, Callaway places them in a context of a series of revolts against Europeans that enabled Native people to establish a measure of autonomy. One of his key arguments is that Indian peoples usually dictated the terms with which outsiders interacted with them. In his book, New Worlds for All, Indians, Europeans, and the Remaking of Early America, Colin makes the point that colonial America in history is not simply a history of Indian wars. He writes, nowhere in North America did Indians and Europeans fight each other all the time. Rather, Native peoples and Europeans were in constant interaction, much of it diplomatic, and for mutual economic benefit. This interaction gave rise to cultural transformations regarding diet, intermarriage, language, and religion that impacted native and white people alike. In Colin's phrase, they created new worlds as the continent was remade into something different from both pre-contact native worlds and from European homelands. To neglect this fact is to neglect a complete picture of American history. In all his work, Colin makes use of a distinctive method that is characterized by tacking back and forth different scales. He zeroes in on individuals and communities, what might be called microhistory, long before microhistory became popular. And he zooms out, looking at the big picture, comparing historical patterns from across different geographical regions and zones. And this is best exemplified, perhaps, in his book, The American Revolution in Indian Country, where he reconstructs the experiences and inhabitants of 8 different Indian villages. So look for these qualities in Colin's work talk this evening. His presentation is entitled Powers in the Land, Indian Nations and the Limit of Empire in North America. Please join me in welcoming him back to Brown.
Well, thank you, Bob, for that very generous and thorough introduction. I have to tell you about that Pulitzer Prize thing, okay? It was a big deal for me, so I called home, right? Tell my wife, hey, guess what? My book's been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. You? You've got to be kidding. Historians, we get so swell-headed so easily. You need to know that. It's a pleasure to be back at Brown, and I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. The first time I actually came to Brown, I think it was 1995, where the native student group invited me down, and I went out to dinner with my hosts, half a dozen people, before the lecture. Apparently it coincided with exam period. It also coincided with a huge blizzard. So the people who were at dinner constituted the audience, and it was in a big hall, and one of those people was actually a professor from Dartmouth who was spending his sabbatical at Brown. So when I say thank you for coming, I mean thank you for coming. I didn't know what to So, powers in the land, Indian nations, and the limits of empire in North America. First of all, as Bob mentioned, I wrote a perfectly good book about 1763. You know, if Brown could have just been founded a year earlier, this could have been a much easier task, right? 1763 is kind of an interesting year, right? But instead, Brown was founded the year after Britain's victory in the Great War of Empire. It was founded at a moment when Anglo-American dominance and continued expansion in North America seemed assured. The confidence was expressed in the history of Brown, written to mark its 150th anniversary. It was no accident that Brown was founded when it was, wrote Walter Bronson. Quote, "In the 7th decade of the 18th century, the tide of life in the English colonies was running strong and steadily rising higher. Forest and field had been subdued to the uses of man. Danger from the Indians, except along the frontier, was a thing of the past. The recent French and Indian War had freed the colonists from fear of their northern neighbors and made them realize their strength." The view from Brown in 1764 did not encompass indigenous power in its vision of the future, or even the present. When the Reverend Joseph Fish arrived to work among the Narragansett a year later, he found, or at least he saw, a community of about 350 people, living on what remained of their ancestral lands in the area of Charleston, eking out a living by farming, fishing, shellfishing, hunting, woodcutting, and deeply divided by land sales, politics, and religion. These poor, unhappy people, thought Fish, needed a school teacher and a minister. Thank you, Bill, for that. As elsewhere in New England, the story to come would have an Anglo-American plot and characters. If Indians figured at all, it would be as casualties of colonialism. But if we pull back on this same map, we get a different perspective on continental realities. Scholars of colonial communities and institutions routinely now situate them in an Atlantic world, and the title of this series urges us to consider things in a global context. But I think we do less well when it comes to placing things in a continental context. Events at Niagara in the summer of 1764, when the British held an international summit meeting with 2,000 delegates from 24 Indian nations, remind us that the continent was still contested by many and controlled by none. Indian nations and indigenous foreign policies had shaped the imperial map of North America by 1764. They continued to temper and sometimes trumped European imperial ambitions, and the continent was still predominantly Native American. Native powers did not create the structures and edifices associated with Roman or British models of empire, but they built and maintained hegemony, expanded their territorial control, exploited peoples and resources, utilized violence, dominated trade, waged economic warfare, and sometimes incorporated European colonists as well as native peoples as subordinates in their patterns of power and diplomacy. The French and Indian War has been called the first global conflict. It was also a continental conflict. It reverberated through Indian country from New France to New Mexico. It was fought on and fought over Indian land, and most of the territory that changed hands at the end of the war was Indian. The forks of the Ohio, where the Ohio, Allegheny, and Monongahela rivers meet, were the gateway to the west and the focus of imperial ambitions. Indians in the Ohio country were caught between the British and the French. That might imply that people like the Shawnee were simply on the receiving end of imperial conflict. Here they are, Shawanoes in the center. But like everybody else, and as Bob, thank you for that segue, they lived at the center of their own world, not at the edges of someone else's. And I have to confess that notion of living at the center of the universe, I get not, I think, from familiarity or association with indigenous worldviews, but being at a place like Dartmouth, which, you know, it's an Ivy League institution, so it's the center of the universe, right? Well, so I think that's where it comes from. But, oops. Now I've messed this up completely. Excuse me. Okay, and there's a little schematic of it. And I think I use this as a teaching device all the time. Any native community, any native tribe, nation, you can just put them at the center of a whole range of relationships with other people. And the purpose of this, of course, is to dismantle that notion of an Indian white frontier and a line that divides America. Indians on the one side, whites on the other, and it's a steadily moving line that goes from east to west. This is much more what it looked like for the Shawnees. And their world might be rendered topsy-turvy by other people's actions, but they assessed their situations, they weighed their options, they made their own decisions to preserve their lands, cultures, communities against outside pressures and pretensions. This is a very simplified version, and we might, with more profit, look at something like this, which is a French copy of a Chickasaw map from the 1730s, but it shows somewhat the same kind of thing, with the Chickasaws here in the center, surrounded by these people. And they are positioned not by geography. That's not what's important here. What's important are the relationships. So from the Chickasaws at the center, there are paths that go out. Some of those paths are closed. Those are paths of hostility or paths that have been interrupted by war. Other paths, are open. So from the Chickasaws are at peace and trading with the Cherokees, and through the Cherokees they can actually be in contact with the English, but they are not in contact with the French at Mobile. And so that just gives us an insight into the complexity of the worlds that we're talking about. These are peoples positioned in kind of a vortex of relationships, but those things are complicated, and they're ever shifting. It's a little bit, I think, like landing in the middle of Afghanistan and figuring all that out. And that's why the French made a copy of this map. That's why these things matter. The decisions that the Shawnees and the Delawares and others made, and the power that they brought to bear, affected the course and the outcome of the French and Indian War. Those who participated directly in the war fought mainly with the French, sometimes with the British, sometimes with one, and then with the other, but always in a consistent effort to keep their country independent of both. Tanarasan, the Iroquois half-king to the region, said that the Ohio country was a country between Indian land, off limits to French and English alike, except for purposes of trade. Tanarasan bragged that he was not afraid to kick the French or the English off the Indians' land. He lacked the power to do it, but his statement reflected Indian policy and strategy of playing the French and the British against one another. Indian villages sometimes flew French and British flags simultaneously. It was a dangerous game, and we should not make the same mistake that many contemporary observers and some later historians did, and interpret shifts in Indian allegiance to indicate a lack of consistency in Indian goals. In 1755, when General Edward Braddock had marched against the French Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio, he'd refused to give the Indians assurances that their lands would be protected under a British regime. Instead, he told the Delaware war chief Shingas that no savage should inherit the land. Shingas retorted that the Indians were not about to fight for land that they would not be free to live on. And Braddock was left to blunder into disaster at the hands of the French and their Indian allies. Instead of falling, Fort Duquesne became the hub of the French-Indian war effort in the West. When William Pitt rebooted Britain's war effort, he appointed General John Forbes to take Fort Duquesne. Braddock had failed to take the fort because he ignored and alienated the Indians. Forbes took it because he grasped the importance of Indian diplomacy, understood that the Indians' consistent goal in the Ohio country was homeland security, and neutralized their power in the campaign. The key to success lay in promising that Indian lands would be protected when the war was over, something that Braddock had adamantly refused to do. Forbes sent a Moravian missionary named Christian Frederick Post as an envoy to get the Indians to attend a treaty at Eastern Pennsylvania. By painstaking diplomacy and working with a Delaware chief named Pisquedemon, this is not Pisquedemon, this is a Robert Griffiths reconstruction of a native person at the time, but I like it because it's a native person with a wampum belt and a calumet pipe on the business of diplomacy, not somebody waving a tomahawk. Pisquedemon was the brother of Shingas and Tamaqua, and Post succeeded. 500 Indians representing 13 nations turned up at Easton in October 1758. Knowing the Indians would never agree to peace as long as they feared that Britain intended to take the Ohio country from them, the British guaranteed that no intrusions would be made west of the Allegheny Mountains without native consent to the Crown, and promised to establish fair and regulated trade. Indians wanted to keep settlers out of the Ohio country, but they realized that they needed to let in traders and their merchandise. The Treaty of Easton seemed to secure them both objectives. Having achieved the goals for which they had fought, they made peace. The peace treaty did not, of course, include the Anishinaabe, the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomis, and other nations around the Great Lakes who were not party to it. The French Empire in the interior rested on a network of alliances with native nations. Maintaining those alliances was expensive, time-consuming, and unavoidable. "One is a slave to Indians in this country," wrote one French officer. French forts in the West depended for their defense less on palisades and firepower than on the Indian people who lived beyond the walls. Once those people removed their support, even a substantial edifice like Fort Duquesne became essentially indefensible. The Eastern Treaty gave Forbes the green light to advance unopposed. Unable to hold the fort without Indian support, the French blew it up and retreated. "After God, the success of this expedition is entirely due to the general," wrote Colonel Henry Bouquet, "who, by bringing about the Treaty of Easton, has struck the blow which has knocked the French in the head." The Indians hoped that the destruction of Fort Duquesne would mark the end of European occupation, not just a shift from one occupying nation to another. 3 days after the fort fell, Tamaqua advised General Forbes, quote, "in a soft, loving, and friendly manner, to go back over the mountains and stay there." Another warned that if the British settled west of the mountains, all the nations would be against them. It would be a great war and never come peace again. The Indians did not want French troops and forts on their land, but they worried that the French collapse left no counterweight to British power in the region. In fact, Sir William Johnson, the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs in the North, claimed that had it not been for his unrelenting efforts to keep the Indians divided, they would have greatly protracted the war in order to preserve the balance of power. At the Peace of Paris in 1763, Britain won an enormous empire. In North America, most of it was Indian country. But the Indian nations were undefeated and had not given their country to anyone. They were, they said, not governed by the French, but free all over the world. Peace reinforced rather than removed their concern for homeland security. The British told them their lands were safe, but the road that Forbes had cut to Fort Duquesne opened their country to British settlement. And Fort Pitt, which the British built on the ruins of Fort Duquesne, was a much more imposing symbol of imperial presence. British assurances that they had no designs on Indian lands rang hollow in Indian ears, especially when the British, on the brink of financial ruin at the end of the most expensive war they had ever fought, dispensed with gift-giving, the essential lubricant of Indian diplomacy. The presence of troops and the absence of gifts boded ill for Indian independence. Having taken the opportunity to oust Frenchmen from their lands, Indians were not inclined to accept Englishmen in their place. Anti-British sentiment exploded into direct action in the war called Pontiac's in 1763. A Delaware chief called Turtle's Heart told the besieged garrison at Fort Pitt, "You marched your armies into our country and you built forts here, though we told you again and again that we wished you to move. Brothers, this is our land, not yours." Pontiac's war almost swept away Britain's new empire in the West, and it accelerated British plans to implement a boundary line protecting Indian lands. The boundary line shown here running down the spine of the Appalachian Mountains. The Royal Proclamation of October 1763 established the Appalachians as that boundary and prohibited private purchases of Indian lands. Only the Crown's representatives could negotiate such transfers, and only licensed traders were permitted to operate there. The government hoped such measures would keep the peace once the Indians had been, quote, reduced to due submission. If we focus exclusively on the Royal Proclamation as the guiding document of imperial policy in 1763-64, we cannot, I think, appreciate how imperial policy was limited by Indigenous power. George Washington said the proclamation was a temporary expedient to quiet the minds of the Indians, and he was probably right. But the British understood that the expedient could only work if the people who called the shots in the interior of the continent were on board and ratified the agreement. As penned in London, the proclamation was a unilateral declaration of imperial will. In Indian country, it became an agreement between sovereign powers based on peace and mutual respect. In the winter of 1763-64, Indian messengers carrying copies of the proclamation traveled far and wide, summoning nations to meet at Niagara in the summer and make a treaty of alliance with Sir William Johnson, who you see has put his own name at the top there. This is a royal proclamation, but Johnson's got himself in there. Johnson understood that he was calling an international summit meeting. In July and August, 250 years ago, 2,000 chiefs representing 24 nations from Nova Scotia to the Mississippi and from the Ohio to Hudson Bay assembled at Niagara. Some had traveled months to get there. Johnson unveiled his plans for a Pax Britannica in North America and presented the Great Belt of the Covenant chain to bind the nations into the existing alliance between Britain and the Six Nations and their allies. The Iroquois there presented Johnson with the Gazwanta, the two-row wampum belt, which I have a replica of here, which is a nice teaching device that we use at Dartmouth. Reflecting their understanding of the agreement as a treaty between two sovereign nations that, like boats following a purple path on a white river of peace and friendship, remain linked by a common direction, but forever separate and equal. So you've got 3 rows of white, 3 rows of 3 white, 2 rows of black or purple representing them. This is a crucially important document for Haudenosaunee diplomacy and sovereignty. The Anishinaabe and other chiefs gave Johnson wampum belts, calumet pipes, and beaver pelts. Johnson gave belts, gifts, and distributed medals. He did not directly translate the proclamation, but in the figurative speech and metaphorical language of Indian diplomacy, he stated quite clearly that the king acknowledged the Indian nations as owners of the land and offered them protection from unscrupulous traders and speculators. So during a visit to Canada in May of 2012, when Prince Charles met with several First Nations leaders in Toronto, they produced a replica of the Treaty of Niagara Covenant chain wampum belt that their ancestors had given Sir William Johnson. They explained its meaning to him and told him that England is not off the hook yet. In other words, that Canada and Britain were still bound by the obligations made here. And this is, this is the purpose of wampum. Right? This is a Huron chief in Britain in the 19th century, but he's reading a wampum belt from the 18th century. He's reciting and decoding that and saying, this is what we agreed to, or more likely, this is what you agreed to. These things have, these are historical documents, these are diplomatic documents, and we need always to hold wampum belts against treaty documents. They're two sides of that coin. Reading the Royal Proclamation alone, we see an Atlantic power asserting its imperial claims to the West. Reading the proclamation in conjunction with the wampum belts exchanged at Niagara, we begin to sense the limits of those imperial claims and get a sense of Indian country as an international space where indigenous powers flexed their muscles and pursued their own foreign policies. Excuse me. Notice how long it always seems to take when a speaker stops to take a sip of water. It seems to take forever, right? That meant, unfortunately for Johnson, that the Indians at Niagara were interested in promoting their own agenda, not his. The Indians who turned up were primarily those who had not, or at least they said they had not, been fighting the British, and were not particularly concerned with helping Johnson defeat Pontiac or secure peace. In fact, many of them did not share Pontiac's desire for less dependence on European trade. Some Odawa and Ojibwa had captured Michilimackinac, the trading post at the junction of Lake Michigan and Lake Huron at the beginning of the war, but most were more concerned with maintaining trade connections than with the threat of settlement, and they prevented the war from spreading. Many Anishinaabe chiefs now made the long journey to Fort Niagara, not because they subscribed to Johnson's vision for a Pax Britannica, but because they saw the meeting and British efforts at appeasement as an opportunity to push for a renewal of British trade at Michilimackinac and other locations. And they got what they wanted. In return, they agreed to allow the British to re-establish the post at Michilimackinac and promised to protect it, quote, as far as they are able. For the Anishinaabe, the conference at Niagara was a diplomatic success. For William Johnson, it was a learning experience. Deeply experienced in dealing with the Six Nations, at Niagara he was touching the edges of an Anishinaabe world he knew relatively little about, where imperial policies petered out, sometimes into irrelevance, and where, to use Michael Whitkin's phrase, an infinity of nations still held sway. During the war, the Senecas, the westernmost nation of the Six Nations, before they killed the British commander at Fort Venango, they made him write down a list of their grievances: lack of trade, high prices, and the presence of British forts on their land, which induced them to believe they intended to possess all their country. The Senecas had also destroyed a British column at Devil's Hole at Niagara. Now, at Niagara, they turned to diplomacy to secure their goals. Johnson talked tough about punishing the Senecas and made a big deal about making them cede the Niagara corridor and guarantee the British safe use of the Niagara portage. But in agreeing to those terms, the Seneca escaped any military reprisals for Devil's Hole and gave up little or nothing. In fact, they gave up a strip of land that they had given up twice before in 1701 and 1726, secured Johnson's assurance that it would be used for military, not civilian use, i.e. not for settlement, at least not for now, and they remained free to hunt, fish, travel, and trade through the Niagara corridor as they had for generations. The Shawnees and Delawares did not attend Johnson's treaty at Niagara. Colonel Henry Bouquet led an army into the Ohio country and finally made peace on the Muskingum River in November 1764 with the Delawares and Shawnees, who, he said, displayed a dilatoriness and a sullen haughtiness in their country. This is an image Dennis, you will find, has produced it in a little display at the back too. The Shawnees reminded the British that they'd caused the war. Fort building was our chief reason for entering war against you, as we had sufficient reason to think you intended to take our country from us. Some officials had called for punitive terms and the execution of Shawnee ringleaders, but Bouquet's army was not there to stay. Instead, he took the Indians by the hand and readmitted them to the covenant chain of friendship. The Indians made some minimal concessions and delivered up some captives, which broke up some families and broke some hearts. Here we've got a series of images. This is Bouquet's the map of the expedition. But if you look at the cartouche in the bottom right corner there, it's kind of interesting. There's a number of interesting things. First of all, the presence of the Scottish soldier, right? Who was very lucky to be there because he's a survivor of Scottish regiments that had been sent to campaign in the West Indies, and most of them just died. So he's a lucky guy. Again, a native speaker speaking on the wampum belt, but then, a number of figures, a woman holding a baby, another woman holding a baby looking a little apprehensive, a woman with a baby crying, right? Because they're delivering up captives. Right? And this was part of the terms by which this piece was made. And it's a famous component of this time period. Right? People who are taken captive and are then liberated have the opportunity to return to the British. As you can see here, very reluctant to do so. Not just children, as the chronicler tells, not just children, but women. They accepted their fate with grieving and tears, and given half a chance, they tried to escape back to the Indians. In the Illinois and Wabash country in 1764, Pontiac still headed a multi-tribal coalition ready and able to resist the empire. Pontiac rejected the wampum belts the British sent him. "We want none of them. Tell your general to withdraw all his people promptly from our lands. We do not intend to allow any of them to set foot here." It took more British peace initiatives and another year before Pontiac and the Wabash nations showed up at Detroit to make peace. And even then they announced that France had no right to transfer their country to Britain, that they were allowing the British to use land for trading posts only, and that they expected proper returns. Captain Thomas Sterling and 100 men of the Scottish Black Watch Regiment proceeded cautiously through Indian country to Fort Chartres and took it over from the French without fanfare to avoid giving offense. The glorious new era of British imperial dominance was not evident in the West in 1764. This was Indian country, no matter what the Treaty of Paris said. It was the British who sent peace emissaries to the Indians. They resorted to gift-giving and diplomacy, not the application of imperial force, and they had to plead with the Indians for consent to occupy the forts that France had abandoned. The Indians did not win the war, but they achieved some military and diplomatic victories. The Ohio and Great Lakes nations had inserted themselves as equal partners in the Covenant Chain Alliance system between Britain and the Six Nations. They remained in possession of their lands, held the British to their promises to protect those lands from settlement, and secured assurances of fair trade. The British modified their vision of empire to fit the power realities in the Indian West. They tried to enforce the proclamation line. People who trespassed beyond it were ordered off. And in 1764, the government wrestled with a plan for the future management of Indian affairs that would have offered some protection of Indian rights. In doing so, of course, they alienated colonial land speculators like George Washington and set in motion a chain of events that led from one war of independence, Pontiac's, to another war of independence, Washington's. On the lower Mississippi Valley, the Choctaws, who were actually a multi-ethnic confederacy, really, of autonomous towns, the most powerful Indian nation in the Southwest. And they were accustomed to being courted by rival colonial powers. Now their homeland had become part of a new British colony of West Florida. Choctaw chiefs traveled to Mobile to take stock of the new order, to establish relations, and ensure that the new owners of Mobile gave them easy access to British goods and guns. But the British had to make adjustments too. They cultivated good relations with the Choctaws, but in doing so, they ran the risk of alienating rival nations like the Creeks, who resented Choctaw dominance and preferred nation status. British colonial officials faced a sharp learning curve as they negotiated with master Choctaw diplomats in a volatile landscape of intertribal rivalry. But Britain now had unprecedented access to the Choctaw deerskin trade. In 1764, the southeastern Indian trade was producing 800,000 pounds of deerskins a year, and many Scottish traders built their fortunes in it. Britain's North American empire rested on Indian trade as well as Indian land. Indian nations deeper in the continent cared less about which European power claimed their country on their imperial maps than about the presence of traders on the ground and the quantity and quality of the goods that they brought. In Canada, the Indian fur trade funneled profits into the Hudson Bay Company and soon the Northwest Company as the rival companies pushed deeper into the interior and trading posts proliferated. Eventually, British traders, and if you look at the northern part of that map, the Ojibwe, Cree, and Assiniboine people they traded with as they moved west would connect with a huge indigenous trade network at the center of the continent that focused on the farming villages of the Mandans, Hidatsas, and Arikaras on the big band of the upper Missouri River in present-day North Dakota. Rigby, North Dakota is actually the geographical center of the continent, not Dartmouth. In 1764, the Mandans had not yet suffered the massive smallpox epidemics that would hit them in 1781 and 1837. One report estimated the Mandans as having 15,000 warriors in 9 villages. Well, surely that's way too high because that would be 60 to 70,000 people. So let's assume that 15,000 was not just the warrior count, that's the total population in 1764. So that would make the Mandan villages alone almost as populous as Boston and New York City and a few thousand shy of Philadelphia, the largest city in the British colonies. But the Mandans and the Hidatsas and the Arikaras would soon feel the impact of the expansion of the Sioux, who were, in 1764, were on the march. Traveling up the St. Peters or Minnesota River in 1766, Captain Jonathan Carter met the people he called Nadawasi, and you can't see it because it's too small, but if you look at the top left-hand side there, you'll see his accounts and details about the Nadawasi. And Nadawasi, from which we get Sioux, is I guess it's a French messing up of an Ojibwe word, Nadawasi, meaning snakes, enemies, adders, that kind of, but they're the Sioux. And he spent the winter with a band of Western Sioux he estimated at 1,000 people. They were beginning a westward push that would establish them as the dominant power on the northern and central plains until they were eclipsed by the United States in the second half of the 19th century. After the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, the western half of French Louisiana passed to Spain. But the board game of empire building beyond the Mississippi was an exchange of pretensions and pretenses. Real power remained where it had been before, with Indian nations whose foreign policies variously incorporated European colonists and frustrated European ambitions. Like Britain, Spain was broke, had limited resources, and confronted a bewildering multiplicity of indigenous nations who were more concerned about each other and indigenous balances of power than they were about European empires and paper claims to territory. Spain faced Indian nations whose power was rising as they continued to incorporate horses and firearms into their societies and economies and arsenals, like the Osage. The year Brown was founded was the year St. Louis was founded. The Chouteau family were French, and when they founded St. Louis, it was French. But in December 1764, news reached St. Louis that it was now in Spanish territory. The Chateau family continued operation. They built St. Louis by trading with, in some cases marrying with, the powerful Osage, who dominated the prairies between the Missouri and Arkansas River. St. Louis in 1764 was a town of 40 to 50 families. The Osage on whom it depended could raise 1,000 warriors. They had ample supplies of horses and guns and had earned a fierce reputation among Europeans and other Indians alike. They had met French traders at the end of the 17th century and were accustomed to dealing with Europeans on their own terms and from a position of strength. They exploited their geographic, economic, and numerical advantages at the expense of other peoples, operated as middlemen, funneling guns to friends, tried to keep guns out of the hands of enemies, and preserved their independence and their dominance in a world of shifting international contests and territorial boundaries. The Peace of Paris had little immediate impact on Osage country. Tribal historian John Joseph Matthews said that the Osage did not know that their French allies, the Heavy Eyebrows, had given up dominance over them, such as it was, to the King of Spain. When Spain did take over Louisiana, the Osage had no intention of observing new trade bans that threatened to undermine the hegemony they'd constructed. Spain hoped to make St. Louis the center of its trade and diplomacy with the Osage and thereby exert control over them. The Osage traded at St. Louis, but they refused to be controlled. They also did business with French, Canadian, and British traders. Osages passed through Spanish St. Louis, blatantly carrying British flags on their way to trade with the British at Fort Chartres. As it happened, however, the furs the Osage traded to the British usually ended up in Spanish hands anyway. Rather than transport their furs up the Ohio River to Fort Pitt and then overland to Philadelphia, British traders took the easier option, floated them down the Mississippi, and sold them illegally in Spanish New Orleans. As the Osage themselves came under increasing pressure from other Indian immigrants to their northeast, they intensified their raids on the Caddos and Wichitas to the southwest. In 1764, the 15 or 20 Wichita villages that stretched across northern Texas numbered between 15 and 30,000 people. The Osage drove them deep into Texas. Spaniards blamed the Osage for keeping the region in turmoil. As Claudio Sant points out, despite population decline, the Osage in the second half of the 18th century, quote, doubled the size of their empire, adding 100,000 square miles to their domain, a rate of expansion equal to that of the 13 colonies and the United States over the same period. For much of the 18th century, Spain had struggled, without much success, to keep its northern frontiers closed against French intruders and Indian raiders variously identified. So you see on this map, Apaches and Paducas. Kind of know who the Apaches are, but who the heck are the Paducas? Well, it depends when you're looking at that map, because we kind of now come to believe that the Paducas was as much an address as it was a name. So sometimes the Paducas were actually Apaches. But in the course of the 18th century, as we'll see, the Comanches kicked the Apaches out of that region, and as they moved into that region and occupied that slot on the French maps, they then became the Paducas. Right? So no wonder the Spanish were confused about who they were dealing with all the time. Now Louisiana belonged to Spain. Texas was an interior province, and Spain's frontier was the Mississippi, across which loomed a much greater threat than the French had ever offered. Spain needed Indian allies more than ever, and lacking the power to enforce its will on Indian country, it relied on diplomacy. And in seeking alliance with Comanches, Caddos, and Wichitas, who could not care less about which king claimed their country, Spaniards had to operate according to Comanche, Caddo, and Wichita diplomatic rules. Comanches held Texas under their sway. Migrating out of the Rockies, the Comanches were building an indigenous empire in the heart of the continent. from the Arkansas Valley to the Rio Grande. Taking advantage of the byproducts of colonial invasion, horses, guns, metal, weapons, the Comanches became colonizers themselves. They incorporated or defeated native peoples who got in their way. They raided for plunder and slaves. They took, adopted, and ransomed captives. They exacted tribute. They built alliances. And they developed a trade network that spanned the southern plains. They could have destroyed or ignored the Europeans who existed on the edges of their domains. When it suited them, they browbeat, insulted, and intimidated Spanish colonial agents, and they raided, terrorized, and killed Spanish colonists. But they also used colonial communities as building blocks in their own version of empire. The presence of a Comanche empire, even the suggestion that Comanche demographic, military, and economic power constituted an empire, compels a rethinking of well-worn narratives about colonial America, about the relative power of European and native societies, and about the directions of change. In the Southwest, European imperialism not only stalled in the face of indigenous resistance, it was eclipsed by indigenous imperialism. The governor of New Mexico had managed to patch together a peace with the Comanches in 1762, but it was precarious and didn't last. In 1764, Spain's imperial power petered out at the edges of the Comanche Empire. The Comanche imperial power was still expanding. So the 1763 proclamation was an important document, an important moment, and I would argue an important point on the road toward the American Revolution. But we need to look beyond it and not allow its imperial perspective to blinker our view of the North American continent. The line the proclamation drew to try and separate Indian and white fits neatly into the East-West narrative that dominates American history. To escape the tyranny of that narrative and the tyranny of our textbook maps that illustrate and perpetuate it, we need not only to face east from Indian country, as Daniel Richter has helped us to do, we need to look deeper into the continent where multiple Indian nations, conscious of their power and confident in their future, faced north, south, and west as well as east, conducting foreign policies, carrying on trade, building alliances, and sometimes bullying the native and non-native peoples at the edges of their worlds. To do that, we need to include Niagara in 1764 in order to understand the proclamation of 1763. Historians have had to work hard to recover such a view of the continent, but we're not making it up. Take a look at the maps, some of which I've shown you here in brown, where the names of Indian nations appear, reflecting a different on-the-ground reality, where European imperial ambitions and pretensions confronted, took account of, and were checked by indigenous nations that were still strong and in some cases growing stronger. In 1764, all across the continent, there were Indian nations whose vision of the continent resembled the view from Brown with which I opened. For Mandans on the upper Missouri, Osage on the prairies, Comanches on the southern plains, the tide too was, quote, running strong and steadily rising higher. Like the founders of Brown, these Indian nations had confidence in their present power and future prospects and saw nothing on the horizon to suggest that their confidence was misplaced. Thank you. I'm happy to hear questions, comments, howls of rebuttal.
Yes, I was wondering if there was any sense with between the politics and the of both Native American nations and the political powers that be. Was there any sense that this was also the time the treaties were being printed and devoured by people? Was there any sense of a disconnect between what the politicians and the land speculators wanted and the common people, or the people that were reading those treaties and fascinated by the eloquence of Native American speakers?
That's a good question. Of course, this is the period. Benjamin Franklin was printing treaties, and he was printing treaties in England. Right? So there's an interestingness and a market for them. And I think we've come to know Indian treaties as mechanisms of dispossession. Right? And I think people like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, etc., saw them that way too. Right? So a lot of what was happening in the Ohio country was pointing back to the Treaty of Lancaster in 1744, where this great session had taken place, etc. In terms of how other people saw that, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I'm guessing that what there is in the reading of this is that there's an exoticism to this, and there's this oratory, but seeing these treaties as in the way that Indian people say Niagara saw them, right, as these agreements between sovereigns, I'm not sure that that's what people were seeing or reading into them. Probably not, because let's face it, how long has it taken us to go back to those treaties and say, yeah, these are important documents that are now a fundamental part of the, if you like, the political fabric of this country, because they embed these native rights. Right? We've kind of been slow doing that. So I think that's a great question, and I don't have an answer for it. Right. Yeah.
Professor Callaway, what if we play devil's advocate with your lecture today?
Mm-hmm.
We told the opposite story. And we looked at a map like this, but we changed a little bit. We looked at population in 1764. Or we looked at origins of the manufacturers that indigenous people have become so dependent upon, like gunpowder or cloth, all the other things.
Right.
You spoke about some of your books. We think about the fact that there are 13 colonies, many more, 46 colonies, I guess, in the British Empire that are increasingly well organized politically and everything else after defeating the French. And we think about it from that perspective. I mean, as you mentioned, you kind of hinted at too, things like the Quebec Act that are coming, Virginians and Pennsylvanians and New Yorkers, they're already dividing up the Ohio country in 1764. They're thinking about it. I think with the Shawnee mobilized and militarized, they're sitting on that land. So the confidence of the British in 1764, and maybe I should say a continental history going from 1764 would be east to west.
Yeah.
It seems like that would be appropriate. And I don't know, just so many women make.
No, absolutely. And of course, that's what we know is the reality. That's what we know happened, right? And so what I'm talking about here is, in a sense, perhaps a vain attempt to say, well, whoa, wait a minute, because the way things played out and has governed our history textbooks, so that there's this inevitability about it. When I talk about the tyranny of the textbook maps, I'm talking about those maps which I've used and you've all seen, which shows the 13 original colonies and the America 1783. So that's us to the Appalachians. And then, the other piece, and then the Louisiana Purchase, and then the war with Mexico. And it's almost, it makes sense, right? This Jefferson's vision of this ocean-bound republic. All these chunks of territory are falling into place almost lockstep. And I think the problem with that is that it obscures an understanding of how things were playing out on the ground at the time. But what it also does, if I can go back to this map, right? Those maps have no place on them for, say, Comanche Empire, right? And think about what that then means, right? So scholars who've done this work, which is not me, but who've looked in Mexican archives, have documented of a picture of Comanche, Kiowa, Navajo, Ute raids that are acting like a war of attrition on first Spain's northern frontier and then Mexico's northern frontier. so that by the time the United States goes to war with Mexico, right, Mexico's capacity for military resistance on its northern borders is shot. Right? Now, that doesn't figure on our maps, it doesn't figure into our textbook, and it leaves some of our students, and I tell you this from experience, having taught in Wyoming, free to say, well, we went down there and kicked butt in the war against Mexico because, well, we all know why. Mexicans are lazy, Mexicans are not good fighters, etc., etc., etc. This has serious implications, I think, for who we are as a society. You put a Comanche empire on that map, right? And then you have to stop and pause and say, well, okay, how did that play into it? So I think that's why I think this stuff is important, not to say that this isn't how it played out, not so that the story's different, but to get a better understanding of how it did come around. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about a juggernaut that's coming, but it's not present everywhere with the same weight at the same time. Yes, sir.
The Indian nation had been formed, at least by 1840, by the U.S. government. And I noticed there's some overlapping lines there. Was there some recognition of the U.S.-supported Indian nation and the Comanches? Were they at war with each other? Did they respect each other? Or what was the relation between the two? That's
Well,
1840.
Yeah. It's kind of on again, off again, raiding and fighting, and there's an interesting set of relations in that whole area. Right? So the Osage I'm talking about, who I'm talking about these people who are used to operating from a position of power. Right? I had a friend who worked on Osage history, is now deceased, but he was actually Cherokee, but he worked on Osage history, and so he was interested in what happened when the Cherokees are shunted, along the Trail of Tears from Georgia and plonked in Indian territory. Right? And they have to deal, and they're taking land that was Osage land, and they're dealing with the Osage. And what happened was, well, the Cherokees were much better because the Cherokees had had plenty of dealings with the United States and knew how to deal with American agents, American policymakers from a position of weakness. The Osage had no experience of dealing with a position of weakness. Right? And so the Cherokees would plead their weakness. We need guns to be able to feed ourselves and defend ourselves from these wild Indians. And so, there's sort of interesting dynamics in that. And of course, the Comanches are not interested in that. They're happy to reduce that to a shambles, to trade with it, to raid it, and try and incorporate in their own vision. And I think that's the important thing, is that you've got a number of different competing and sometimes overlapping visions of, in this case, the West at the same time. And some of those are native. Right? And of course, by 1840, the Comanches are already I'm not sure that's the right date pattern there, because the Comanches are already feeling that pressure. Right? I mean, one of the things that has already happened is that unable to resist Comanche and other indigenous raids from the north, the Spanish government does what colonial governments often do. They bring in people to serve as a buffer, right? People who are, Scots-Irish, right? You take people from an area of the world where for 500 years they've sort of been killing each other, put them in Ireland to act as a buffer against the Irish, then take them from Ireland to Pennsylvania to act as a buffer against the English, and then, not surprisingly, they finish up in Texas. Right? And so that whole story of Texas independence is tied up with all of this kind of thing, too. Yeah, sir.
What is the artifact on the podium?
This is, is what we simply call the two-row wampum belt, Guswenta, Guswenta, depending on its pronunciation. And I have, this was gifted to me. I have another wampum belt that I bought for use in class purposes, but this one's kind of neat. And I wrote a book on Indian treaties a couple of years ago, and I'm still waiting for the review, but I'm about to get trashed in that review from an individual I know who says that because I've talked about this at the beginning of this book, because it's so important to people that I know, because it very clearly and simply illustrates that sovereignty, right? That a treaty is not an act of submission of Indians agreeing to terms foisted upon them. It's an agreement between equals, between two equal sovereign powers. We will be allies, we will be friends, and we will be at peace, but you're not going to mess with us, you're not going to dismantle us, etc., etc. I think that's, in that, I think it's an artifact, it's a document that tells us a lot about not only perhaps present Haudenosaunee and Native views of the treaty relationship, but also tells us an awful lot about the realities of the situation. The reason I'm going to get trashed is because the original of this is said to have come from the first treaty between the Iroquois and the Dutch in 1614, 300 years ago. And there is a scholar out there who has, in print, demonstrated to his satisfaction that this is an invention, that this never really happened. And when I mention it in my book, I talk about how important this is, and I don't say that it's an invention and that it's all wrong. It's one of those things where do I go with the sort of oral tradition and the people whose history this is, or do I go with an academic?
We don't have to answer that.
No, that's a rhetorical question.
But I think that the wampum belt is actually a very good place to sort of close, because it actually brings together a place like the Museum of Anthropology and the importance of material artifacts and the amazing readings that you did of the maps that are housed in a collection like this, and the different kinds of literacies that those represent,
Exactly. Yeah.
the different ways that we as scholars can read them, and the different ways that objects, whether they're maps or belts, require us to understand and to engage with different kinds of communities that have different understandings of what these objects actually are.
Because
So-
without that, we are illiterate. And I use this in class a lot. I'll hold up a treaty and I'll hold up a wampum belt. So I can read the treaty, and sometimes students have a hard time doing that, 18th century document, but they can do that. So, but here we're illiterate, but it's just as rich and just as detailed.
So I did want to point out that our curator, Dennis Landis, has put together a mini exhibit of materials from the collection that are over in that glass case over there. Want to reiterate the invitation on behalf of the Museum of Anthropology to join us for the reception. It's in Rhode Island Hall, which is the building right next to University.
No, it's okay.
Manning Hall. Don't go to Rhode Island Hall. Right, there you go. I got lost here a lot. And there we can have a drink and do what we should do also now, which is to thank Colin Callaway for a fantastic talk.
Thank you.